Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak about this bill, which incorporates quite a lot of well-meaning objectives into an omnibus bill. And next to me, I have a fair bit of paperwork, and this was only presented to this House on Monday. And we have here a bill that comes to 200 pages, which, if it passes this House and the Senate, will join the 1,200 pages of the Fair Work Act. So we're looking at 1,400 pages in order to navigate your way through the employer-employee relationship. Now, you don't have to be an industrial relations lawyer to know that that creates enormous complexity and uncertainty. And you don't have to be an industrial relations lawyer to know that businesses, particularly medium and smaller businesses, don't have armies of lawyers and other staff to help navigate all of the paperwork and forms that come with this. And they should be quite rightly upset by this, because in all of the promises and speeches that were made in the lead up to the last election, this sort of radical reform to our industrial relations system was not on the cards. It wasn't put to the Australian people. And we've heard lots of lectures from the other side about integrity and about transparency. But when you look at this 200 pages and then the mammoth, weighty explanatory memorandum that's supposed to help us resolve ambiguity, I mean, if that's helping us resolve ambiguity as an explanatory memorandum, God help us, and God help a struggling business that is struggling to survive as it is, and many are. And we heard some really disturbing economic news today. I don't like to talk the economy down. We want it to succeed because it's about people's lives. But we heard from the Treasurer that annual GDP growth slowed from 2.3 to 2.1. Now, the unfortunate reality of that number is that was the aggregate GDP. It wasn't a GDP per capita per person. So it's a GDP propped up by population growth, mostly through migration. And there's bipartisan agreement that we are a much stronger and better nation for our migration system. But we should never pretend that that is the substitute for productivity growth. Because when Australians have been hit with the consequences of high inflation and the cost of living crisis that comes with it, the interest rates rises that hurt particular sectors of our society, not just our economy, people who are just paying off their home, people who are trying to put food on the table, and then people who have had the worst circumstances possible, which is either unemployment, an illness, or a family separation. They're the people we all see in our electorates queuing in food banks who are struggling to stay within the system. So when we look to the laws that surround the employer-employee relationship, we should ask, what will this do for productivity? What will this do for potential increases in unemployment? And the sad reality that this proposal risks damaging all of those. This proposal will increase costs, increase complexity, and add red tape to an already highly regulated system. It's one of the most regulated employer-employee systems in the world. And for those who are contemplating starting a business, this is just another reason to say no, to not bother. And that's the last thing we need in this economy. Now, what the government should be focusing on is a way to increase productivity. And when you increase productivity, then you see wages grow. You see enhanced competition. Instead, we've seen the government focus on restricting competition, and we've all heard the speeches and questions put about the airline industry, but that's where the government's focus is. Not all of them. The member for Fraser's popped out. I know he, in his background and his chair of the Economics Committee, is focused on productivity and dynamism and competition. Now, in the referendum that's coming up, you may be asking, what's that got to do with this debate? And has a little bit to do with this debate, because we've heard lots of lectures from the Prime Minister and the ministers and the entire side of the chamber that if you listen, you get better results. And who would argue with that? Of course, if you listen, you get better results. That's our job in this place. But that doesn't really work if your listening involves selective hearing. You only listen to the things you want to hear. You don't listen to the things you don't want to hear. And the member for Parramatta, in two 90-second statements, in his passion for the voice, and there's passionate disagreement in this place, in his passionate support for the voice, he singled out the support of the business community. He noted in two 90-second statements that it's great to see so many Australian businesses jumping on board to provide their support. He singled out BHP, Woolies, Optus. In fact, there's 13 out of the top 20 ASX companies have taken a position, and that's their right to do that. He then said the opposition leader has no business trying to silence business. He criticised the opposition leader for saying he tells them they're virtue signalling, he tells them to stick to their knitting. And then in his second speech, the member for Parramatta said if the coalition doesn't even understand business support, then they have no business getting in the way. Well, if the member for Parramatta is very keen to listen to business and the groups that represent business, well, let's listen to them, not just in the things you want to hear, but all of them. And we know that in our Constitution, in Section 128, the decision for amending the Constitution is with the people after it passes this place, not with corporate Australia, with the people. But the business of the employer-employee relationship actually is their core business. That's what they do day to day. So if you're going to be selective about what you listen to from business, the economy and employer-employee relationships is a pretty good one. So let's hear what some of them had to say on this matter. Jennifer Westacott, the Chief Executive of the Business Council, said this: Australians should have safe jobs, well-paid jobs and rewarding jobs, but the government's radical shake-up of the industrial relations system will not deliver that. She added this: these changes will create confusion and extra costs for consumers, make it harder to hire casual workers and create uncertainty for employing anybody. Any government that's serious about the cost of living would not do this. Now, the government say they're serious about the cost of living, and yet this is exactly what they're doing, something which risks increasing unemployment, risks reducing productivity, at the very time when we need to be doing the opposite. And Jennifer Westacott added this: we need a system that drives productivity, not stifles it, because that will stifle wages growth. The case has not been made for this radical shake-up. And the member for Parramatta should reflect on those comments. He was quite critical of this side for not listening to business. Is he going to listen to that view of business? And it doesn't stop there. The Minerals Council of Australia, again, we heard the Prime Minister say with glee that they were supporting his position on the voice, even though they're not mentioned in Section 128 of the Constitution, but that's fine, that's their right. But they do have a particular interest in the employer-employee relationship and growing this economy and growing productivity. So Tanya Constable of the Minerals Council said this of the Albanese government's latest changes: the changes will inflict immense harm to the economy, the weight of which will fall on the shoulders of the most vulnerable Australians, who will pay more for groceries, housing and energy. The Mineral Council calls on the Australian government to rip up this bill and head back to the drawing board. And there's many other stakeholders, representatives of business, who have very strong views on this. And you may argue from the other side and reply, well, of course they would say that. They're just acting in their national interest. Well, if you're going to say that, well, then what's the self-interest that they're acting in when they support things you do like? You cannot have selective hearing about this. And some of the more troubling aspects of this are the expansion of union powers in workplaces. And that gets to the heart of what we're really dealing with here and why this is in the form that it is, and it wasn't put to the Australian people before the election. And I'll single out union delegate powers. Union delegates will have a new workplace right to protect them against employers that refuse to deal with them, mislead them, or hinder or obstruct their right as a delegate. A mandatory term would be included in awards or enterprise agreements giving effect to primary and ancillary delegates' rights. The ancillary rights include reasonable access to communicate with members and potential members about matters of industrial concern, workplace fatalities, paid time training, as well as delegates having paid time to create these functions. Now, again, there are parts of that reasonable people could agree on, but that is not the effect of this in the way that it's drafted. The bill will amend the Fair Work Act to enable unions to exercise right of entry powers without any notice, no notice, whenever it relates to wage underpayment. To gain immediate entry, the union only needs to assert the Fair Work Commission that they suspect, and that's a very low threshold of proof, suspect, a case of wage underpayment. No evidence is required to make their case. Now, the National Farmers Federation have made a very important observation here, in that they are concerned about the new rights of entry without notice and how they would affect farms, because I don't represent a rural or regional electorate, but there's a couple of farms in the eastern side, and what I know is that their business is their home. It's where they live. It's where they bring up their children, look after their parents. And to have this sort of regime impose that right of entry on their home is extremely concerning. It should concern all of us. All of us should be concerned by that. Now, I said at the start there are some worthy objectives here, but again, the devil is always in the detail. And when we come with an omnibus bill like this, this is the sort of bill that we see more in other democracies. The United States Congress is known for bundling a whole bunch of special interest issues into a bill that has a very catchy headline. And both sides will engage in that in their bipartisan democracy, but it's not a healthy thing. And it makes it hard to focus on the particular parts of it. Now, the Coalition supports, on the issue of wage theft, that wage theft should not occur. And there was a proposal by the Coalition, when it was last in government, to actually stamp this out. And the Coalition has a zero tolerance for any exploitation of workers, including underpayment of wages and entitlements by any employer. And if the minister was serious about wage theft, then why did he lead the charge to vote down the Coalition's proposal to legislate a wage theft provision in the Fair Act work in 2021? Now, he came in here at his speech and listed the things that he thought we need to come in here and defend. Well, he needs to defend that. He needs to come in here and defend his decision when he was on this side and refused to address that issue then. That would have helped people who are affected by wage theft in the meantime. Now, the government has overreached on wage theft in that it's not properly separating accidental theft. Well, all theft is, by its nature, should be intentional, as opposed to intentional theft, which is, for those who've studied Criminal Law 101, the most important thing in the criminal justice system is the intent. That's the part that is punished. That is the part that we seek to disavow in the community, so that others who are thinking of engaging that activity say, well, I won't do that because of the effects that will happen to me, the general and specific deterrence that comes from that. But if we're going to include accidental misallocation of wages, and that can happen, and it's more likely to happen when you're dealing with, as a business, with 1,400 pages of relevant legislation. It's more likely to happen. So this proposal, in the way that it's put, makes wage theft more likely, not less likely, more likely. And so we ask the government to refine that particular part to focus on the intention of wage theft, because that's the effective part. When you punish intention, you actually have a deterrent effect in the community. Now, another key part to this, and in the time remaining, is when these laws come into effect. They're due to come into effect, if they pass, in November 2024. 2024. Now, what's happening there? Is this so urgent that these loopholes have to be fixed now? Or does the minister and the government know that the actual implementation of these will create real harm in our economy and in our society, and they want to push that off till after the next election? Push it off. So putting political interests before the economy, political interests, before growing productivity and reducing the cost of living.
I thank the member for Menzies.